Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to start this high-level side event of the United Nations ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum. We have a panel of eminent leaders and experts. There is great interest to our panelists to allow the little time we have to quench the thirst. I ask the panelists to help me in managing the time by limiting each response to, I would say, 3 to 4 minutes. We will begin with Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation, Arab Republic of Egypt. Prior to her current position, Dr. Al-Mashat has been an effective Minister of Tourism, the first woman to hold this position in Egypt. Previous positions included advisor to the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, sub-governor for monetary policy at the Central Bank of Egypt, and senior economist at the IMF. Excellency Dr. Al-Mashat, our session is organized by your ministry, the Egyptian Ministry of International Cooperation, under the title of Pushing Stakeholder Capitalism Through International Cooperation. Can you please explain what is meant by stakeholder capitalism?
Thank you very much, Doha, and I'm very honored to be with, of course, my colleague, His Excellency Minister Tariq Al-Mullah, my very dear friend and also colleague Merrick from the World Economic Forum, and Sergio from IFC. I think that this side event being organized by us, the Ministry of International Cooperation, and given the importance of this topic, stakeholder capitalism. When we talk about multilateralism today, it's no longer government with international institutions or government to government. It's really everybody together. Stakeholders include the private sector, include civil society, include the government. And that's why COVID was a very important test. However, it showed and brought very prominently the need for all of us to work together to be able to push forward. And if I'm going to use UN language, to leave no one behind. It is not just the government by putting policy that it will be able to push economies forward. It is the need of the private sector to be mindful of what's happening and participate. It's also very important for the government to pave the way for that to happen. There's a role for civil society, and definitely the international community plays a very big role with us as well. In our case, we have been trying to push this concept once and twice and again. We have shown in 2020, despite the very tough financing, I would say, pressure, because the government, with the private sector, with the international community, civil society, everybody had very clear goals. We were able to secure financing of close to $9.8 billion, 6.7 to sovereign projects, and 3.2 billion to the private sector. And this is how significant the topics that we are pushing for through the principles of stakeholder capitalism, including inclusive economies, including fourth industrial revolution, including better education modules, environmental stewardship, and governance, agile governance. These are some of the principles, but this is what we try to weave in our work, and also collect and collaborate with the different stakeholders to push forward. So this is just at the outset what I wanted to mention in terms of the importance of this concept for the work that we try and push forward with all our partners, bilateral, multilateral, also the private sector in each foreign companies abroad, and also civil society. Thank you.
It's been a challenging year, no doubt. I now turn to His Excellency Dr. Tariq Al-Mullah, Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources. Dr. Al-Mullah has been in his position since 2015, building on a distinguished career spanning more than 3 decades, during which he held leadership positions in the private and public energy sector in Egypt and globally. Excellency Dr. Al-Mullah, you lead a very important sector vulnerable to conflict. Yet you have effectively applied the second principle of stakeholder capitalism, namely stimulating economic integration. Please tell us about your experience in this regard, including the establishment of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum.
Thank you, Doha, for the question, and thank you for having me today in this important forum. Dear Minister Dr. Rania, thank you for having us. I would like to also welcome my colleagues Merrick as well as Sergio. I'm very pleased and honored to be with you. If I go to the question, let me go by saying that the Egyptian government really believes that the integration will help realize massive successes for Egypt. And we also have started the implementation of economic reforms starting perhaps mid-2015. And we had said that we started to realize this serious steps of economic reforms in November 2016 with the flotation of the Egyptian currency. The idea is to stabilize the economy and to address macroeconomic imbalances for the benefit of all stakeholders. Having said so, the government had also undertaken a set of legislative reforms designed to make the economy more attractive for investments. Therefore, when we talk about the oil and gas sector as one of the main contributors to the Egyptian economy and has a broad spectrum of activities, which really requires the dealing with diverse stakeholders on local and regional and international level. And our main aim is to integrate all different stakeholders' need, whether from citizens to local investors, IOCs, and financial institutions, and create the benefit for all of them. So this would let me go to the part of the EMGF, which is the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, and how Egypt has initiated this forum back in 2018 as a platform for the economics integration and structured policy dialogue among and between the East Mediterranean countries. And this was thought of how we can cooperate all together, whether producing countries, consuming countries, or transit countries in the region. So we can leverage then the commercial and financial and technical sides to balance the interest and benefit of the region. The idea is to deal with regional challenges and utilize the available infrastructure that we have in order to quickly monetize the existing and future gas reserves to promote the regional peace. And this was the idea behind the EMGF. The EMGF was very successful in receiving desire from different countries to participate and to join. We've been able in last September 2020 to sign the statute, and last March 21 we were able to have the forum entering into force. Having said so, we've been able to have the US as an observer and France as a member, and this was the decisions made lately, early last month. When we talk about the contribution of the private sector to the EMGF, we have to say that there is also underneath the ministerial level, there is a gas industry advisory committee that is that comprises different members, and these members are different companies, international companies or state oil companies or EPC companies, as well as financial institutions. We have to tell you that we have already in this advisory committee more than 29 members now, and we are talking about having and we hope to have great results across the different aspects. That's why we are having and engaging with different stakeholders. So it is not only on the level of government and ministries, but also with the private sector and companies and different disciplines of the industry. Thank you, Doha.
Thank you, Excellency. Speaking of private sector, I would like now to turn to Sergio Pimenta, Vice President of the International Finance Corporation for the Middle East and Africa. He previously held several prominent positions, including Director and Global Head of Industry, Manufacturing, Agribusiness and Services at IFC. Mr. Pimenta, we've heard from government leaders. As the IFC's representative, how do you foster the private sector to push for stakeholder capitalism?
Good afternoon, and I hope you can hear me well. Good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in this panel with these distinguished panelists, and thank you very much for inviting me. Let me try and address your question on how IFC is supporting the private sector in this time, in this difficult time. And the first point that I would make is that really one of the big changes that are needed in today's economies and in today's societies that we are seeing is really the deployment of the digital economy, and how the digital economy is really having a major change in our lives and in the lives of the population. And what we're seeing with COVID is that the impact on the societies and the economies is really very strong, and it's creating also a lot of divides that need to be addressed. And actually the digital economy can help bridge that, and can help to a large extent people, governments, companies manage the difficulties of working under the conditions that is impacting all of us. So what we are doing as IFC and as other DFIs is we're really trying to see how we can realign our support to make sure that we are even more present in this context, and that we are helping the economies weather this difficult crisis that is going through. So that's what we've been focusing on significantly. We've been doing a multi-pronged approach, a three-step pronged approach, with first, bringing a lot of liquidity as a sort of an immediate response to companies that needed it the most. And second, we had a second phase of helping try and stabilize what was happening on the economies. And now we are really looking at focusing on the future, focusing on rebuilding the economies, and doing so by focusing on what can be the sources of divide, as I said earlier, and try and reduce those divisions and reduce these gaps that can be met in the economies. When we look at building for the future, we need to build better, meaning we need to build greener. We also need to focus on reducing the gender gap. And so focusing on building an economy that will be more inclusive, more sustainable, and more prosperous for everyone. And that's what we have been really focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mr. Pimenta. As we proceed to finish our first round of questions, I turn to Mr. Melik Dushik, the World Economic Forum's Deputy Head of Geopolitical and Regional Affairs, and also Head of Europe, Eurasia, and the Middle East and North Africa. Mr. Dushik spearheads several publications, including the Global Risk Report, the Arab World Competitiveness Report, and the Future of Jobs and Skills in the Middle East report. Mr. Dushik, you have helped win regional consensus on the principles of stakeholder capitalism. After you heard from ministers and the IFC, how do you see the prospects of applying these principles and their contribution to building back better after the pandemic?
Thanks so much for having me. I wanted to first thank you, Minister Anya, for not only having me today, but also for helping us spearhead these principles among over 60 CEOs and ministers in the region. We did that back in the summer, and your role has been instrumental. So thank you. Also great to see you, Minister Al-Molla, and great to see you, Sergio, as well. As I see this as something that's going to be further accelerated. This was a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call, COVID, for everyone, and public-private cooperation in the spirit of stakeholder capitalism is something that we believe is really going to decide the future competitiveness of nations and other stakeholders. And we see that not only these 60 that signed these principles of stakeholder capitalism, but many others are really waking up to the realization that this is something that is needed at an accelerated pace. In terms of the companies, what it means, as we all know, ESG is now becoming so important for companies. We work on it a lot at the World Economic Forum. What is challenging is that we have a fragmented space in terms of reporting, and so we're trying to make sure that in terms of governance, the companies actually are able to face a predictable accounting standards on the non-financial disclosures there. But it's a wave that's happening, and we need to make sure we can measure it well for impact. But as Minister Rania mentioned and other speakers, stakeholder capitalism is not about companies only. This is really about public-private. What we did back in the summer is we just stated the what. And if you look at the 7 principles, and let me just briefly state them, it's about inclusive economies, it's about economic integration, reshaping education systems, harnessing the fourth industrial revolution, promoting environmental sustainability, mitigating global health risks, and committing to good and agile governance. Many of them are things that all of us here have worked on in the past. So this is where really the acceleration part comes in, and the fact that it's now embraced from all corners. If we talk about the region, they were crafted for the region, from all corners of the region and from many, many industries. This to me means that there is a wider acceptance. If you allow me, just
Sure.
There is one thing around public-private cooperation at an accelerated pace, and I think again that's quite mainstream right now. But there is also around how do you actually do this cooperation between the public and the private sector. And we are, of course, in a changing geoeconomic and geopolitical landscape globally. There are shifts that we all observe, but we're seeing in that landscape also that then there is more openness to new forms of collaboration. And one particular type which excites us a lot at the forum is really these coalitions of willing nations or other stakeholders that are really so committed to a certain topic that they just create something and go with it. And so at the World Economic Forum, for example, we work on the fourth industrial revolution. So you have these hubs that are established in different geographies, but the value for those is not only that they then connect around AI or data with us at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, but the real value is around how do you connect with your peers in the network. And so this willingness of governments in particular to experiment in a peer-to-peer setting is arguably something that is really a new type of cooperation for this post-COVID era, and I would predict that we're going to see much more of that in the future. One case which I could mention is, again, which we've established so successfully with Minister Rania, is we have Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator now in Egypt established. Well, it's part of a wider network of countries sharing best practices of how private and public protagonists can actually effectively address this issue across geographies. Back over to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. You mentioned the need for new ways of public-private cooperation. From the answers we heard, it's clear that the private sector has a central role to play in stakeholder capitalism, and this will be the theme for our second round of questions. Excellency Minister Al-Mashat, you've stated that the 2021 year is the year of private sector engagement. Can you elaborate on that? What role does the private sector play in enforcing the principles of stakeholder capitalism, and what new ways should be there and needed for private and public sectors and cooperation?
Thank you, Doha. And when we finished 2020 towards the end, we felt that Egypt stands out as a very good development story, a very successful when it comes to, as Minister Molla mentioned, in terms of how there was a transformation in energy transformation, also in electricity, a focus on a green recovery. We have one of the very important flagship projects related to renewable energy done with IFC financing to private sector as well as to the sovereign. So there's plenty that needs to happen going forward. And if we are keen on creating inclusive economies, if we are keen on closing the gender gap, if we are keen on creating more jobs, trying to push the potential of the economy, government cannot do it on its own. Private sector is fundamental. Private sector is important. However, as Merrick was describing, the private sector itself today incorporates very important sustainability goals in their work. And this is something which all governments are keen on, because all of us have a 2030 development agenda, i.e. trying to fulfill our SDGs by 2030. And therefore, we felt that during this year, as the different IFIs, as the international community is rolling out different tools of financing, which are related to green, which are related to innovation, there is a very important potential through our role as Ministry of International Cooperation to bring these important stakeholders together, international community with the private sector. As my colleague, Minister Tariq mentioned, the government always sets its reform agenda to be able to create that conducive environment where everyone can come and actually work together, be it the international community with the private sector, or the international community with the government, or the private-public partnerships where we have very successful examples. So that's why we wanted to roll out 2021 as the year for private sector engagement. We took our time to be able to put together an agenda which would create more understanding of how the private sector can be engaged through different financing tools from the international community, and give actual examples that took place before the pandemic. We have fantastic examples in the case of gas and petroleum that we will be hosting my colleague Minister Tariq to talk about, similarly with Minister of Electricity. Also, we have very important companies which open up the lead for others. SMEs are extremely important as well, the entrepreneurial spirit that exists among youth in Egypt. So how can you actually take all of this energy and channel it in a way that is transparent and actually conducive to results, impactful, i.e. we will be able to achieve more of the SDG goals that all of us are very much today looking forward to focusing on, and the pandemic has actually pushed us further, realizing the importance of this agenda.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Excellency. Excellency, Minister of Al-Molla, you have succeeded in leveraging private sector investments. Please tell us about the recent trends of FDI to Egypt in your sector.
Thank you, Doha. Well, I have to start by saying that we have had really great challenges, and I have to say that this was the aftermath when we had, since January 2011 till June 2013, having two revolutions in 30 months. Really, this has negatively impacted the investments, and we were not able to restabilize until perhaps mid-2014, 2015. And the result was that many foreign partners had suspended their projects, and we have accumulated a lot of arrears. We had great shortages in fuel supplies and electricity. It was a chaos. Anyway, so as I was explaining earlier, with the reform strategy that the government has adopted around 2015, we started to put, as well as the oil and gas sector, to put a strategy together with the modernization project that we launched later on, where we were able to put priorities in order to unlock all the oil and gas sector's full value chain potentials. And we were able really to achieve very positive economic indicators. I have to say that we have been adopting some innovative economic models where we were able to promote the investments, and our priorities has always been to retain our partners and to attract more foreign companies and investments. What happened is that we are currently having more than 60 international oil company operating and working in our oil and gas sector, and they are doing their businesses in all the geography, whether in the Western Desert, Eastern Desert, the Mediterranean, in the Delta, Nile Delta, and so forth. With this new fiscal regime that we have adopted, we've been able to apply more flexible and of more benefit to our international oil companies to attract them. And this has resulted into more than 84 concession exploration agreement signed with them over the last 5 years. And this meant, in other terms, a commitment of investments of $15 billion. And these are agreements that were ratified by the parliament. So there is seriousness and commitment. I have to tell you that over the last 5 years, we have received more than $40 billion of investments in the oil and gas sector. And we are now looking for continuously having this yearly average of 8 to 10 billion. It depends on how the projects will be prioritized. At the same time, last year we've been able to have a contribution of about 24% of the GDP, we as oil and gas sector. And in spite of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, we've been able still to continue on having our concession agreements signed with new partners. Among those, we've been able to attract super major oil companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron for the first time. And I have to say that we also, as part of our promotion to investments, we've been able to digitally promote the sector by having a new platform, which is the Egypt Upstream Gateway, that is digitally addressing the subsurface of Egypt. Nevertheless, this is part of how we are able to attract and to motivate new investments and partners to where we are now considered as, and this is not an exaggeration, but really this is what is the position now, that we are considered the go-to destination for major oil and gas investments in the region. Thank you, Doha.
Thank you, Excellency. I now turn to, I ask Mr. Pimenta, COVID-19 has imposed new priorities, new challenges for governments and private entities. How can public-private partnerships advance the development agenda and bring the sustainable development goals, SDGs, to the fore of reform and into the design of financing instruments?
Thank you, Doha. And I hope you can hear me well. I'm having a few IT connections, unfortunately, so I hope that this will go through. Answering to your question, I agree with you that COVID-19 has made both governments and private sector rethink how they prioritize their activities. But as Minister Al-Mashata said earlier, it is very important to have actually both the private and the public sector deliver not just on economic activity, but also on the development goals, on the SDGs. And this is something that I find extremely interesting in the approach that the Egyptian government has taken in particular.
Oh, we lost the audio, I guess.
The role that
Mr. Pimenta, we lost, we cannot hear you.
running.
I don't know about the rest, but I can't.
In terms
I think we can.
of looking how not just the governments are focusing on.
I think we lost connection with Mr. Pimenta. Shall we wait for?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me again?
I can hear you now.
Sorry, I'm having problems, and I'm really sorry about that. My connection seems to be very weak here. So I don't know exactly when you lost me, though. I was saying that just building on what Dr. Rania was saying earlier, that SDGs are important not just for government but also for private sector entities. And one aspect that I find very interesting in the approach that the Egyptian government has taken under her leadership is exactly that one, to make sure that public and private are working together towards the same development goals. And this is an area we've been collaborating with and it's something that we really can push forward. Private-public partnerships play an absolutely crucial role in the way the economies can recover from the crisis. Because as you were saying in your comments, in your question, governments had to prioritize a certain number of expenditures that are related to health, related to immediate relief for companies, that it creates an additional burden on the fiscal positions of governments. So the private sector can and has to step in and provide additional investment, additional funding, so that we can all together work towards the development goals. And this is something that it's really, there's a clear role for both private and public sector, and partnerships is the way to go forward to make it work. At the IFC, I mean, we've been very supportive of this approach. I mean, IFC being the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, it's something that is very natural in our way of working. And in Egypt, we've been able to actually launch some of the very interesting innovations, particular the one that Mr. Mashat was mentioning in the sector of the renewable energy, with the very large, I mean, the largest solar park in the world in Ban in southern Egypt. That is a major project where you could see that with the right framework created by the government, with the right regulations, with the right reforms, then you have a large number of investors, both foreign and domestic, who come in and support the setting up of what is now the largest solar park in the world. So it's really a big success of leveraging public and private in the partnership that work. What I find very exciting is that we are working with the government on other areas there where this can be done. We are looking at furthering the agenda on the solar energy and renewable energy, and this is one of the areas that we are working on. But we can also look at the same model and do it in other sectors, whether it's, for instance, in water treatment, desalination. This is one of the sectors where, again, traditionally the public sector has played a key role, but there is space for private sector, and the right private-public partnership can bring in the right players who can contribute in terms of investment, knowledge, capacity, and this is where you will see the private and the public work together towards the SDGs. So I think it's very important to get this type of partnerships ongoing. I think Egypt plays a leadership role, not just in the region, but I would say across developing markets. I mean, a lot of countries are looking at what Egypt is doing as a good example of how you can leverage private sector, and you can bring private sector if the public environment is the right one, the right reforms, the right business environment and investment climate. So I'm really excited about what's happening in Egypt, and I think we can go much further, and I'm really looking forward. I know the other DFIs are doing the same. We are all ready to support so that we can have a private sector that works hand in hand with public sector to deliver on development goals.
Thank you, Mr. Pimenta. If we lost the audio with you, I would really suggest that you turn off the camera if that happens again, to free some width for the internet. Now I turn to turning to the confluence of finance and digital economy. I asked Mirek Dushik, how can the integration of digital assets into the MENA economies tackle the financing challenges faced by small and medium enterprises, SMEs, especially to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? The world is having a tough battle with the pandemic and on every level and every sector.
No, thank you. Thank you, by the way, for giving me the opportunity to speak about a concrete application, if you will, of the fourth industrial revolution. It's driven by the need to not leave people behind. I think Sergio talked about that with regard to the digital economy. It's actually related also, and Minister Anya, and related to also other transformations we'll talk about later, like climate. But here, when we talk about COVID and digital economy, SMEs have been hit hard across geographies, not only in the Middle East, but across geographies. We recently published a piece with the Minister of Economy of the UAE, Abdullah bin Tuq, on the application of one technology, a blockchain and tokenization, on possibly mitigating some of the gaps that we have with regard to how SMEs can access capital. It stems from one of the hubs I mentioned. It's around the fourth industrial revolution. So we have one hub that is sitting in Dubai, and again, they're trying to experiment with regulation. So they work with us, but they also work with other hubs in other geographies around certain issues related to technology. And so here, blockchain obviously is a technology that has become almost mainstream. It's something that there are many applications to blockchain, but one is around digital assets and how they can help SMEs to get financing or get access to capital. And so there, how it works is for those they may not be familiar, is that the digital assets can represent, of course, liquid assets, but they can also represent illiquid assets like real estate and a piece of art, for example. And the magic here is that they can actually be divided. And so then that's the process of tokenization, where then if it's fractions of the underlying asset, they are possibly better accessed by investors, but also the SMEs are able to get more capital from different sources as a result. In an environment where still a lot of them, if you survey SMEs across geographies, a lot of them do complain about how difficult it is to access capital. And again, putting COVID, and it's even more important to resolve this. Now, we published this piece, but we also said, listen, this is not the answer. It's just one application. There is, of course, a lot of excitement about digital assets and digital currencies globally, but we also say with the same breath that, of course, the regulation needs to be there. And so there is, you may know, quite a good momentum in certain geographies around establishing crypto and digital asset legislations that may be able to then provide some kind of a standardization and predictability for investors and other actors in that ecosystem. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, again, it's a very fractured landscape. So ideally, we could have interoperability, and there will be a reliable framework for international exchange of these assets. And again, this is something that we experiment on and we work on, and others, I am sure, as well. But I think why it's important and why I'm glad you gave me that space to talk about that is that it's really about how do we use these technologies that exist, but how do we make sure that we have the spaces for experimentation, peer-to-peer, for governments and private sector to come up with solutions that can actually help with inclusion. In this case, it's toward SMEs, but in other cases, it can be addressing another issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Dushik. In some circles, capitalism is juxtaposed against the environment, yet from what I heard, stakeholder capitalism and the environment can be mutually reinforcing. The intersection of the environment and stakeholder capitalism is what we will focus on in our third round of questions. Minister Al-Mashat, what are your views on integrating green resilience and inclusive development, or GRID into national policies?
So one thing we've all learned from COVID is we cannot keep up with the acronyms that are pushed at us. But GRID is a very nice way to explain what we all are looking forward to achieving. And when I say all, it's all stakeholders, government, private sector, international community, and NGOs, and that is a green, inclusive, resilient development. When we talk about this, we are saying that maybe COVID could have derailed us from our development path or process. And that's why it was very important that governments come out. In our case, this was very clear, saying that it is not going to derail us from our SDG agenda. On the contrary, we will try and reinforce and use this pandemic as an opportunity to continue reforming. And that's why we have a very ambitious green recovery agenda with very clearly identified mitigation and adaptation policies, which we are doing with different private sector companies and also with the international community. Inclusion is something which is extremely important. And as Merrick mentioned, in addition to the national agenda related to gender, we launched a new initiative with the World Economic Forum, and it's a private-public collaboration platform, Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator, with very concrete targets and an action plan. And then resilience. The only way as a country we were able to withstand and mitigate the implications of COVID as much as possible and standing out relatively better than others is because the reform agenda is a continuous one. Minister Mullah explained his reform agenda that happened at a very tough time when things were the odds were against us. So the reform agenda happened pre-COVID and it continues during and after. And that's the only way that any economy can stay resilient facing any other kind of shock that might come. So these green, inclusive, resilient development is under each one of them also lies the principles of stakeholder capitalism. And that is what we try to do in the design of whatever project we are doing with the international community through the line ministries that come through international cooperation to actually design and implement. We currently have 377 projects, a development financing agenda of $25 billion. In 2020, there was an additional 10 billion. So at the heart of all of this is Egypt's 2030 development agenda, the SDGs, and the urgency of keeping that always a focus is even more time before. So those are the few words I would say.
Thank you, Excellency. Turning to Dr. Al-Mullah, the fifth principle of stakeholder capitalism is promoting environmental sustainability. How do you see the role of partners, including the private sector and the international community, in protecting and regenerating the environment?
Thank you, Doha. Well, actually, I have to start by talking about our Egypt's vision on promoting the environmental sustainability. And this is when we have adopted the 2030 vision, and among which was the important pillar of the economy is energy, definitely. So we have developed also a 2030 sustainable energy strategy, and among which we have taken into consideration how we could combat the global warming by lessening the greenhouse gas emissions. Also, we have to say and to acknowledge that Egypt had contributed to the Paris climate goals and the worldwide decarbonization efforts, and this is through our participation at the Zero Flaring Initiative, where was introduced by the World Bank. Meanwhile, we've taken the decision of definitely diversify our energy portfolio and energy mix, among which, of course, the natural gas was the, I would say, the transient energy till we reach the full utilization of the renewables. Having said the natural gas, I have to tell you that we as a government, since we are optimizing and capitalizing on our natural resource of natural gas, we have launched different important national projects where we are maximizing the household gas connections, introducing more gas to our transportation modes, whether vehicles, buses, trucks, all sort of moving equipment, as well as trying to find all benefits for natural gas in order to reduce the gas emissions. Meanwhile, as we all know now, that hydrogen is becoming something very important that is supported by different international organizations and the European Union. We have been able also to have some important, and we are trying to have an important role in the production and the exportation of hydrogen. Therefore, we have now a national committee where we are now under developing this hydrogen strategy. Meanwhile, I would like to say that since we've mentioned also the EMGF, we've also initiated through the ministerial meeting a proposal for a roadmap to collaborate within the members in order to put different options for natural gas decarbonization for the Eastern Mediterranean region. When we talk about the private sector, and this is very important, we have to realize that we have been observing definitely lately that there is a global shift from policies that usually were supporting oil and gas production to policies that are starting to disincentive the fossil fuels. And having said so, we are definitely adapting ourselves on that and recognizing now that the oil and gas companies and international investors and partners are trying also to find ways and to identify technologies in order to be designed to support more of decarbonization to the oil and gas. So therefore, the investors are becoming and looking for strategic drivers for decarbonization actions, and wherefore we are looking at what we talk about environment, social governance, focused investments. And this is how we deal with this new shift that we have to admit and recognize. We are, as oil and gas companies that we are partnering with here in Egypt, we are responding by looking on how we can do business together in confronting this model and to adapt our plans to the decarbonization world. Definitely, this is all in alignment with the focus of having the and to use more of renewables and new technologies that would help and would definitely go with the decarbonization into any of the producing assets. So we are talking about having the lower carbon footprint that we need to have in order to make sure that all our policies and the market would use and deploy all the energy transition that is needed locally in order to match with the international and global policies. Thank you, Doha.
Thank you, Excellency. Mr. Pimenta, how can the private sector's engagement stimulate inclusive, sustainable development through regional competitiveness?
Thank you very much, Doha. I hope you can hear me better now. I'm sorry again for my connection issues earlier. Look, how can the private sector engagement stimulate more through regional competitiveness? I think it's a very good question, because we are looking at the impact that COVID is having on all the economies. And what we realize, of course, is that the burden of the crisis is really falling on mostly hitting hard the poorest people, and a lot of companies, a lot of countries that are in a difficult situation get in an even worse situation with what's happening. So when we look at that, we can look at, of course, the role that the private sector can play in a given country, but also you have to look that with the shift to more digital economy, countries are actually more competing among each other in terms of, you know, having an operation that is based in one country versus another one. You can have companies have more options and more choices. So I think it's very important that we then create in every country that needs it an environment where companies will resume investing, resume contributing to growth, resume creating jobs, and jobs, including for the youth, which in MENA is really very impacted by unemployment, including for women that, again, in MENA, in the Middle East and North Africa region, women's participation in the labor force is still very low. So this is where we have to look at how each country can really improve its business environment, improve the connectivity of its economy, so that the private sector can play a bigger role in development. In Egypt, in particular, IFC has been really focusing on this question and helping the connectivity and the competitiveness of the country, not just when we look at the broader regional picture, but also within the country, between the different parts, between the different parts of Egypt, different regions, how we can make sure that the development of the economy is inclusive and it's being positive for everyone across the country, across different sectors and across different initiatives. So this is something that we've been really focusing on, and our programs in Egypt have been looking at, as much as possible, what are the sources of competitiveness that can be unlocked and what can be done to unlock it. For me, very clearly, one of the major areas where there is a strong potential that is not tapped yet fully in Egypt, like in many countries in the region, is the women's participation in the labor force. And you know, if we were to unlock that and have women more engaged in the workforce, we would have a significant growth of the economic activity, of the GDP, and ultimately a much stronger contribution and a much easier way to reach the development goals. So this is one of the areas that I think we should all focus on. IFC has made a very strong effort in collaboration with the Egyptian government to include gender components in all our projects, whether on the advisory side or on the investment side. And this is really one of the areas that we've really been focusing on. At the end of the day, when you look at what development is for people. And what IFC has been doing together with the government of Egypt, with our partners, development partners, with the private sector, is really to focus on how we can invest in people and help people contribute more to the economies and to the well-being of the society. One of the areas that I would just want to mention in closing that has been important for us in investing in people has been supporting the health sector. And we have, of course, all this crisis started with a pandemic. So focusing on the response to the pandemic, focusing also on the quality of the healthcare provision across the country has been a priority. We've invested almost $150 million in healthcare in Egypt. We have a pipeline that could reach $300-400 million in the next couple of years in Egypt in that sector. This is something that we really want to push forward so that we can improve the quality of life of Egyptians.
Thank you so much. Finally, I turn to Mr. Doshik to ask him, as the private sector embraces the new green reality for investments and growth globally, what opportunities lie ahead for multi-stakeholder engagement on environmental and financial sustainability?
Thank you. You're right. This is the second big transformation. It's the digital and the sustainability transformation. I talked about the ESGs And this is a global trend now, and it's something that I think, again, companies they need to decide whether they want to be on the right side of history on this, and many are, of course, so voting with their feet. But that's also going to create a new competitiveness landscape globally, and so it has tremendous implications to economies in different geographies. So if there are any economies that think they may be immune to this, of course, this is going to be driving the behavior of investors across the globe and how they behave towards all the economies of the world. So this is something that I just wanted to put out there. The year 2021 is a huge year for achieving or helping us achieve net zero at some point. This is the year of COP26, and so to your question, there is many companies, and not only multinationals, but others that are really engaging in the COP26 process and other connected processes that are there. And this is something that is so much important. Not only is there the official process, but there are others. We have a coalition of stakeholders we call Mission Possible. And I'm mentioning it because there the focus is really on hard to abate sectors like steel, like construction, gas, etc., and those, or infrastructure. But even there, we're working actively, and CEOs are on the front foot, working with governments and others to try to chart the pathway to net zero. So that's the global play, if you will. But then there is, of course, the closer to home play, where I do work also on Europe, so I'm heavily engaged in how we work on this issue in Europe. As you may know, the European Union has the European Green Deal, a hugely ambitious plan driven by the Commission and the member states. But then the implementation is going to be with the public-private dynamic, and that's what we are working on. And there is so much appetite, not only from the private sector, but also from the public sector, to really work out what does it actually look like. I will give you an example around how do you actually decarbonize the food system in Europe. Those of you who know Europe very well, you know that there are all kinds of socio-economic implications when it comes to agricultural sector. And so how do you manage to square the circle of meeting the challenge yet not leaving people behind from crucial communities that have a huge also symbolic significance for many in these economies. I'm mentioning the European example, but it may be relevant for other geographies. So what we do there is we work on something called lighthouse projects. So there it is going from the what, which was, for example, something that Minister Rania and I, when we talk about the principles of stakeholder capitalism, it's the what. We kind of describe the ambition. The European Green Deal is the what. The how is then these lighthouses, where we try to chart the paths forward on decarbonizing food systems, on decarbonizing, for example, buildings. So how do you work with the industry around that to have less of a carbon footprint of buildings in the future? So that's a European example. If you just give me one more minute. But my point is, this is while maybe Europe is perceived as being on the front foot, and they are, of course, this is so relevant to all other regions. And so in the stakeholder capitalism principles, we do have one principle that is on environmental sustainability, and we see a lot of companies really stepping forward on circular economy, on other ways in which we can actually mitigate the effects of climate change. So this is also an encouragement to other geographies that this is so important. And it's about creating new sectors. So Europe, what's behind this also is to make sure that we actually create a new economic sector. And so if we are to then make sure that other geographies are equally competitive on this issue, it's so important that that others are on the front foot, and many are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Now we will now entertain sample of questions from the audience. I'll turn to Minister Al-Mashat with this question from Al-Ahram online. What are the government plans in securing development finances in 2021?
Okay, so I always mention this, development finance is not a goal or a target in itself. We respond towards a financing gap that exists. So I cannot say that I'm targeting a certain financing in 2021 or 2022 for that matter. What happens is the government, based on its development strategy, decides how much of it comes from domestic financing and what the financing gap is. And then we decide what is the best option in terms of foreign financing. Is it through development finance with our international partners? Is it through commercial banks? Is it through international markets? So there's an array of ways to secure foreign financing. In our case, international cooperation is responsible for the development financing, which is with IFC, with World Bank, with EBRD, and so forth. And this is a type of financing which I always say is quite useful because it's longer term. There's a grace period. There are elements of transparency, governance, and also any project that we do with our international friends always has elements of or guidelines and standards related to environment and other principles that the Egyptian government really champions and is committed to. So short answer, we don't have a target per se.
Mm-hmm. Also a question from, thank you so much, a question from Al-Ahram online to this time to Mr. Pimenta. How the IFC has been supporting Egypt's government and private sector during the ongoing crisis?
So thank you. So during the ongoing crisis, I mean, IFC has stepped up its operations in Egypt, both in terms of investment and in terms of advisory. As I mentioned earlier, we had this sort of three-phase approach to helping countries and, I mean, private sector in emerging markets handle and weather the crisis. In March last year, we got so when the pandemic sort of really started becoming really a global concern, we approved an $8 billion facility to help companies with immediate liquidity, companies in our portfolio, and the first countries actually in the Middle East and North Africa region that benefited from that facility were companies and financial institutions in Egypt. So that was the first thing that we did. We also did in sort of the helping in the second phase of sort of stabilizing, restructuring. We really focused on helping companies in the health sector, and we did support a certain number of hospitals through financing that we did over the last 12 months. But also we've been looking at how we can support value chains across the economies, and this is something that we're also considering in Egypt. And then the sort of looking ahead and looking at the sort of the third phase of rebuilding better, more inclusive, in a more sustainable way. We have been doing interesting operations in Egypt in various sectors. I mean, both ministers mentioned some of the interventions that we've been doing, and in particular what we've been doing on the energy sector. Not only we had done before the crisis some investments, important investments in the solar energy, but we're also looking now at more financing in that sector. And we are looking at expanding our private-public partnership programs. So we are very active in Egypt. It's a very important country for us, and we will continue supporting the Egyptian people through its private sector through our investment and advisory work.
Thank you so much. A question from the Middle East News Agency to His Excellency Dr. Tariq Al-Mullah. What is the ministry's role in promoting green projects for the local market and its portfolio in light of accelerating the transition towards a green economy?
Well, as I explained in my earlier explanation, talking about our commitment to environment and decarbonization and zero emissions, carbon emissions. So what we are doing, as we said, that we are prioritizing all the projects that are related to natural gas, taking that this is from one side as a transition fuel to reaching the goals of total renewables. Having said so, we have already put into place 3 years ago an independent gas regulator. We have an independent gas regulator that is backed by a gas law that allows for all private sector and independent companies to come in and to participate and to contribute to the all the value chain of such projects, among which comes different projects related to the supply chain, whether it is from the shipping, transformation, storing, marketing, whatever it takes. And our role is really having to promote and to avail all these opportunities and to identify them. Not only that, and to help allowing all their needed permits, licensing, in order to, which is happening, to cut all the red tapes and to be able to overcome any challenges that may face any investor. So we are really promoting all projects that are related to low carbon emissions and to greenhouse promotion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Excellency. I just want to tell the participants, raise hands if you have any question. I'm going to take only one or two more, and because of the time. Another question, but this time from the Daily News Egypt. It's a question for Dr. Rania. How far does Egypt's economy and structural reform program support the domestic economy to counter the drop in 2021 growth?
Okay, so reform is a topic that is very close to my heart, but between 2016 and 2019, this was a period when Egypt embarked on very important monetary and fiscal reforms to overcome distortions that were there for several years. And along the same line, or along the same time, there were structural reforms that took place. We always say that structural reforms take place at the sectoral level. As Minister Molla mentioned, he was doing structural reforms in his sector. And when that happened, it opened the potential for additional investments and for really a change. You know, structural change or structural reforms create that change that pushes the economy and pushes the potential. When I was Minister of Tourism, I did structural reforms in that sector, and we were able to push the potential. Currently, with international partners, we're also undergoing a development policy framework, which has, again, several structural reforms related to the green recovery, related to doing business, related to gender agenda. So many of the legislations that were there for several years are going to be changed, particularly to address what Sergio was mentioning, this idea of gender participation. And there's a very nice term that the IMF came up with a few years ago. Women's participation is macro-critical. So it's no longer a statistic only, but it's really a value. You add to the GDP of the economy, and therefore you add to productivity, you add to competitiveness. So the agenda is one which is extremely important. And one element that I would always like people to bear in mind is that when we are doing our structural reforms, they are in line with international standards, because no country is in isolation of the world. You cannot do something without taking into account the changing dynamics every day. And that's something that I think this government is very exposed to, whether it's, I keep on referring to Minister Molla because he's with us today, but in other sectors, it's also the same. There is a great level of exposure, discussions with our international partners, being them the private sector or international institutions. So it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process, and we try as much as possible to our annual report this year was titled Writing the Future in a Changing Global Dynamic. So every country is trying to write its future, but it has to be mindful of the speed by which the global economy is internalizing new concepts, and they should not be foreign to us. They should be entrenched in our thinking and in our policy design.
Thank you, Excellency. As we near the end of this rich discussion, I will ask each panelist to briefly share final thoughts. Perhaps you want to tell us about what patterns can we detect in the successes and failures of stakeholder capitalism to inform how we tackle our modern global challenges. Think COVID-19, think climate change. We will reverse order of speakers and start with Mr. Toshik. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to just share something around startups. We haven't really talked about startups too much, but it's something I have worked on a lot in the region, and I wanted to acknowledge the great work of IFC, for example, on creating new markets and what you've done there recently, even pre-COVID. And of course, Egypt has one of the biggest strategic depths around both VCs and startups in the region. Why I'm mentioning this, because while of course there is a huge human toll of the pandemic, and this is of course horrible, when we've convened our stakeholders, many VCs and startups and others that we convene have also started saying, well, but this is also a huge opportunity to build a new economy for the Middle East and North Africa. And I have been running actually competitions of startups since 2015, and I've been amazed how many of pockets of excellence there are that are already telling us what the future could look like. And they don't sit only in, let's say, the biggest economies of the region, but they also sit in the corners that you would not expect. So it's really with that that I'd like to finish just to say that, of course, there are these pressing risks that are out there, but I would invite you to take a look at the current landscape of not only, let's say, the well-capitalized startups, but also others on the landscape of startups in general. It will give you a good picture of what we could do together in the region post-COVID.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Mr. Pimenta?
Thank you, Doha. And I think it's been a very rich debate and hard to summarize, but when we talk about stakeholders, capitalism, it's all about inclusion. It's all about how we bring everyone around the table to work together to reach the same goals in terms of development, in terms of prosperity, in terms of well-being, and so on. So I fully agree, and I appreciate what Mirek was just saying in terms of the importance of getting that inclusion when it comes to the digital economy, when it comes to startups, and it's all of us working together on sort of thinking about how is the new normal going to be? How is the new economy going to be after this pandemic? And working to reaching that goal together. And I really commend what the government of Egypt has been doing in terms of preparing for that future. And I'm looking forward to continuing working with the private sector in Egypt, with the government, with the partners, development partners, and others with the civil society, so that we can all aspire to a better world after this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellency, Dr. Al-Mullah, any final thoughts?
Actually, I will summarize my thoughts and in few words based on the success story that we had over the last few years. It is all about inclusion, partnership, win-win, transparency, and communication. And I think these are the 5 magic words for us. And this is what led our energy and oil and gas sector in Egypt to have this high level of recognition, and was really a success story over the last 5 years. So it's inclusion, partnership, win-win, and transparency and communication. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Mashar?
Well, after what Minister Mullah said, I think he did a brilliant conclusion. And all I want to say is that this platform here is an example that the international community, the government, those who, and if we had a private sector, it's really all of us are today talking in the same language. In the past, there might have been diversions, but there's now consistency in goals and actually a very agile way of finding ways to make it happen, whether it's through financing tools, whether it's through different matrices and metrics to quantify ESG, greater transparency, as Minister Mullah says, and that's why for international cooperation, for instance, we brought up this point of global partnerships narrative so that we have a consistent way of telling our story, because that creates and entices more interest in further development. So I'm very happy with the work that we have been doing with our colleagues and partners and friends all over the world. And I just think that this is the true silver lining in the pandemic, that we were able to redefine and not lose focus about the priorities and speak a language of collaboration, partnership, and one that really serves us and our people and the planet as much as possible.
Thank you. Thank you all. It has been a pleasure moderating this stimulating discussion. No summary can do it justice, so I will not attempt one. Just to say that we come out with renewed hope that the region can build back better as we see the light out of the pandemic's tunnel. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the audience for their attention and the eminent panelists for their valuable contributions. Her Excellency Dr. Ed Mashal, thank you so much. His Excellency Dr. Ed Mullah, thank you so much. Mr. Pimenta, thank you so much. And Mr. Dashik, thank you all so much.
And thank you, Doha, for your great moderation of this session. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.